There's not much better for a reader than being surprised by how good a book is. Hello and welcome back to Bookish, and welcome to another one of my list videos. I couldn't think of 11 titles here, so I went with 10. I've kind of been trending towards 10 instead of 11. If you know, you know. So I have 10 books here that surprised me by how good they were. Now, these are books I've probably already talked about on my channel at some point in the past. And what I was looking for here was kind of surprise me in a really specific way, and in a way kind of unique to that book. And I think as we go along, you'll kind of get an idea of, why the book surprised me and why that made it good. So I'm just going to start off with my favorite books of all time since I've been in BookTube, and that's Leonard and the Hungry Paul by the Irish writer Ronan Hession, which is just a story of two men who are kind of seem to be at a pause in their life, and then events kind of get going and they emerge from that and they move forward and they in their own ways embrace change. And it's a really pleasant, sweet, good-natured story about two guys doing what these guys do, and their friendship is lovely, and their relationship with their family members is usually relatively lovely, and you just kind of end up rooting for both of them, I think, and being a champion of both. So what surprised me about Leonard and the Hungry Paul when I read it a long time ago was that I picked it up because it was on the Republic of Consciousness prize list in whatever year. I can't remember exactly what year it was. It seems like it was right around the beginning of the pandemic, so probably 2020. I picked it up because it was a part of the Republic of Consciousness Prize list, and I don't know if you ever read books from the Republic of Consciousness Prize, but it's a prize given to small presses or a book released by a small press in Great Britain, and now there's one here in the United States. And the books on the list have a tendency to be experimental, or you might just say weird. And so to find a book on the list that was excellent and was anything but weird, and it's in the story it tells, to tell its story as directly and as Perkins did, I found that to be a surprise, and it's a great book. The second book on my list is Ohio by the author Stephen Markley. He had another book come out this year, which I believe was The Deluge, or is called Deluge, and it's 700 or so pages long. I've heard good things about it, but I haven't been, willing to take on a novel of that length yet. And to be honest with you, when I started reading Ohio, I thought I was going to DNF it. Ohio begins with kind of a set piece at a parade honoring a young man who graduated from the high school there and went on to join the military, who was killed in Afghanistan or in Iraq, I can't remember which, and there's a parade essentially as honor. And that opening set piece is one of the worst things I've read in a long time. I just think it's terrible. I don't know why that wasn't rewritten and wasn't taken out of the book. I thought it was just full of cliches, and maybe that's the point. Maybe it was supposed to be, but either way, I thought it was terrible. So what's surprising to me about Ohio was how good the book was after that. If you get past, if you're like me and you're reading that opening bit, that set piece, and you can get through it, after that, the book really is, I think, excellent in kind of looking at the ordinary tragedies and extraordinary tragedies and secrets in small town, particularly small town, economically struggling small town life, and how that impacts people in the future. I thought the book was really good if you can get past that. So a surprise was that it got so much better. And number 3 on my list is The Beast They Turned Away by Ryan Dennis. This is a book I found on the Republic of Consciousness Prize, and it is weird. And the thing that surprised me about it the most was how much, me having read the Toyn about Cuchulainn, the great Irish cattle raid, or great Ulster cattle raid, one of the, Irish kind of medieval stories, how much that figured into my appreciation of the main character, and why it seemed to be all about cows, and why there was violence, and this main character who is essentially, I think, like a grandfather to this boy who freaks everybody in the small town out, and his defense of that child and his care for that child, despite being a fairly unpleasant, violent person. I thought the book was pretty extraordinary, and one I haven't seen talked about very much at all. At number 4 on my list is a book I just read this year as a buddy read with Hannah from Hannah's Books, and that was Sapphira and the Slave Girl by Willa Cather. This book was only the second book by Cather I've ever read, and to be honest with you, I was expecting something more like My Antonia, which I read and I really liked. I thought the writing was beautiful and the story is pretty straightforward. Well, in Sapphira and the Slave Girl, it's not such straightforward. And what surprised me about the book was how nuanced Cather's portrayal of slavery in the South before the Civil War actually was, and how complex all the characters are. Sapphira is a white woman who owns slaves, and the slave girl is, of course, one of her slaves, and there's some tension. And, you know, what surprised me was how honest Cather was, whenever it was, I think in the 1930s, in showing all aspects of slavery and how close she came to kind of, you know, talking directly about the sexual violence which went along with slavery, and how many different ways that topic could be approached. And then even the idea of abolitionists, you know, perhaps wanting to serve their own ends, and pushing people maybe to do things they didn't necessarily always want to do. I thought it was really, really good, much more interesting than I expected, and I appreciate Hannah for asking me to buddy read that with her, because it was great. At number 5 on my list, I have The Age of Innocence by Edith Wharton. Surprise, surprise. I'm talking about The Age of Innocence again. And so what surprised me about The Age of Innocence was how perfectly pitched the whole novel is to bring you to the conclusion, to bring you to the moment of revelation that, you know, Newland Archer has near the end of the book about the woman he's married and the world he's in, and essentially how he's kind of stuck in this, in upholding perhaps ideas and values which he doesn't specifically believe in, and how cleverly that was done. His wife, whose name I can't remember right now, her masterful use of language and image, and her own, you know, her own approach to things is just incredibly well rendered to kind of make it clear to Newland Archer that essentially he's stuck, and there's nothing he can do about it. And it's just brilliant. And Wharton's writing is brilliant. You know, I kind of like House of Mirth a little better than Age of Innocence, but Age of Innocence is perfectly written. So what surprised me about it was how perfect it is. Just how perfect a novel that actually is. Number 6 on my list is Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. This is the story of a woman named Mrs. Dalloway who's having a party, and intermixed with it is the story of a young man who has returned from World War I, damaged by the war, and his struggles with, you know, shell shock, I guess, for a better lack of a term, PTSD, and Mrs. Dalloway's kind of dealings with her own family, her husband, her daughter, an old kind of friend slash boyfriend from the past who comes back. But what surprised me most about Mrs. Dalloway is the excellence of the stream of consciousness. I've read Faulkner. I love William Faulkner. I like the hard William Faulkner novels. I do. I like Joyce. Read Ulysses a couple of times. Understand maybe 42% of it. Okay, I think they are masters of stream of consciousness, but they do not hold a candle to the stream of consciousness technique that Virginia Woolf practices in Mrs. Dalloway. It is perfect. At one point, we travel through the minds of people down the street to the florist, I think, in which Mrs. Dalloway is, and we inhabit the thoughts and the minds of various people as we go down the street. And it's truly, I think, a transformative piece of writing. And so it surprised me with how great that piece of stream of consciousness writing could be. Number 7 on my list, the 7th book on my list, is Lote by Shola von Rhienhold. This book is kind of, in some ways, I think it's kind of a mess. It's kind of all over the place. But what surprised me about it was how much stuff there is in it. How much, you know, historical fiction it is. How, you know, inventive the von Rhienhold was in creating this character around who a lot of the story in the past revolves. It's also a dark academia book. It's a book about young people trying to find their way and, you know, having all kinds of problems. I just thought it was a whole lot of stuff in a book, and it surprised me by how engaging and how, for me at least, in reading the book, the world in which the book takes place felt complete and felt like, real in a sense. The next book on my list is The Real Cool Killers by Chester Himes. Chester Himes is a black writer who lived in the 40s, 50s, 60s and on, and he's most famous for writing crime novels centered in Harlem, and The Real Cool Killers is the first one of those I read. He introduces to his two main characters, who are black policemen working in a largely white police department, and their beat is Harlem. And what surprised me is how realistic and gritty and vividly he created for his readers the Harlem that he wanted to put on the page. Whether that's the real Harlem or not of the time period, it doesn't matter. The Harlem that Himes creates is an incredibly real, complex place where terrible things happen, where optimism and hope maybe had not quite died, and where, these two policemen are kind of fighting against the odds in some ways to preserve some semblance of hope for everybody. That at least was the impression I got, and it surprised me how vivid that world was and that recreation was. Number 9 on my list is The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones. This is on my list because I don't read horror, and this is definitely a horror novel by an Indigenous American author, and I was just engrossed in it immediately. The story kind of combines, or is about a group of Indigenous American men who were friends, lived on a reservation in poverty. They did this kind of horrible thing, and then what happens is that the spirit world comes and intrudes to a certain extent and takes its vengeance on them. And just, there were moments in the book where I was reading, literally going, oh no, don't let that happen. And it would happen and be like, oh, this is terrible. It's awful. It can be graphically violent. It is disturbing. If you don't, particularly want to read about hunting and things like that, there's that in the book. There's also violence, human being to human being. But I really thought it was good at kind of blending Indigenous American experience into a work of horror to create a really effective story. And so that surprised me. And the last book on my list of 10 books that surprised me is Piranesi by Suzanah Clarke. This just shouldn't be a me book. This just shouldn't be a book kind of set in a surreal world, a house in which, rooms flood, and a huge house. There's only one person there who really lives there, and they spend time figuring out how to survive and try to figure out the world in which they live. And then, as we go along, they meet, I believe, they continue to have these meetings with what I think they refer to as the professor. And we begin to learn more and more about the reality in which this person lives, or the unreality in which this person lives. And I found it to be incredibly satisfying and incredibly the place in which the story mostly takes place, I thought was really well created and really well described. And I was surprised how much I liked it. I would call it maybe a work of fantasy to a certain extent. Certainly it strays from reality, but I was really surprised how much I liked it. Anyway, there you go. There's my list of 10 books that surprised me because they were surprisingly good in all kinds of different ways. I look forward to your comments in the comment section below. And as always, thank you for watching.